Hello, welcome from Civil Society Europe and the EnTrust project consortium. So we would like to welcome you to this debate on informed evidence, informed policymaking, and the role of knowledge intermediaries. So this debate is organized in the framework of the EnTrust project, which is on enlightened trust in governance. And this project is funded by Horizon 2020, so by the European Union, and is devoted to the study of trust and distrust in governance. And in this context, of course, the role of science and trustworthiness in science is very important. In this event, we will discuss the role of scientific evidence in policymaking and what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are the limitations, and what perspectives we can have in this context. And we have actually, through our project, drafted a manual for evidence-informed policymaking. And this manual looks at the different problems that policymaking encounters in the use of evidence and what can be the processes, the path, the methodology that can be used in this context. So this discussion is aimed to have a feedback on our manual and also to exchange experiences based on actually the work and the role of the knowledge intermediaries. So once again, welcome to our discussion, and I would like to give the floor to Christian Lauhusen, who is a professor at the University of Siegen and is actually the coordinator for our project, and who will present the manual for evidence-informed policymaking. So Christian, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Carlotta, for introducing myself, and I'm very glad to be part of this event and very pleased to see your interest. I've prepared a very short presentation on the manual we have been written. I don't know if the presentation is accessible now. Carla, if you might be able to share it. Basically, the motivation for this manual comes from the fact that we are researching the role of trust and distrust in governance, as Carlotta said. And here, basically, we were also thinking that it's important to think about our own role as scientists in generating evidence-based trust in governance. So we want to reflect basically what our contribution as scientists or experts can be. And for this reason, we argued, and this would be the next slide, please, that indeed scientific evidence is of importance for what we consider to be good policymaking, but also trustworthy policymaking. And this is substantiated by one of the surveys we conducted, showing that indeed citizens value the trustworthiness of scientific expertise in policymaking. This is the red bar on top, although for me the label is missing, but it relates to basically expert committees in policymaking. So we see that indeed citizens argue that the trustworthiness of policymaking does reside on sound scientific evidence. Now, the problem is that it is not that easy to say what should be the role of scientific evidence in policymaking. And here, basically, two questions are key. How much evidence and which kind of evidence basically is to be selected? And here in the manual, we very briefly describe indeed two challenges. On the one hand, there is a more cautious approach in research debate, that we should not think that policy should be based on evidence, because this would overemphasize the role of evidence and downsize the role of policymaking, so that the debate is rather moving towards evidence-informed policymaking. So politicians and decision makers, stakeholders, intermediaries should be well aware about what evidence is available and then translate evidence into correct policies, arguing that it is not always self-evident what the political implications of scientific evidence is. And the second challenge to evidence-informed policymaking is basically the high disciplinary fragmentation and pluralism of available scientific evidence, which in a way is heating also public debate, ranging even to statements of post-truth, arguing that for any political interest, for any political decision, there will be some form of evidence, meaning that science is increasingly instrumentalized for political contentions and thus delegitimizing basically the value of scientific evidence. So we have to be concerned about the correct way of using and feeding scientific evidence into policymaking. And please to the next slide. So this is basically the background for what this manual is trying to do. It is trying to help those interested in identifying pertinent scientific evidence, or also those who want to commission or develop their own scientific evidence of what four principles basically are helpful in identifying this question of which evidence can be used how. Now, the first principle, please, the next slide, is called the principle of appropriateness. And here we are arguing that policymaking is a very complex process of starting to identify core problems that await solutions, then identifying potential solutions, implementing solutions, and trying to deal with non-intended risks and consequences of these interventions. So we have different stages of the policymaking processes which require different forms of political evidence. And for this, we are relating to the question, well, the first thing you have to clarify is which scientific evidence is appropriate for the specific policymaking problem you want to solve. And here there are matrices available, which we think are very helpful to identify that there are various forms of evidence that can be used for various policymaking problems. And I don't need to go into the details, just basically highlight that indeed science provides different methods, different theories, which generate different forms of evidence that can be fed into different stages of the policymaking process. So this is basically the first question you have to answer for yourself. The second one, and this is the next slide, refers to the principle of quality. So once you have identified the appropriate scientific evidence, you have to look at the question whether this evidence conforms to quality standards. And here we identify two forms of quality standards. The first are related to the scientific quality standards, which I guess most of you are quite familiar with. So you have to assess the quality in regard to the standards that are applicable in science themselves. However, additionally, you also have to ask for the quality standards that are more relevant for the policy making purposes. So you have to assess whether the theoretical claims help you to identify the problems, the solutions, the non-intended consequences. You have to look for the empirical validity of the evidence that is generated. However, you also have to look for the applicability and the impact of the scientific evidence you are consulting. Next principle, as in the next slide, relates to effectiveness. So once you have identified the evidence and you have checked the quality of the evidence proposed by scientists, you have to check whether it is effective, because that's basically what you as a policymaker are most interested in. Does it help? Does it work? And here there are, again, two sub-criteria which you can employ. First of all, you have to identify supportive factors or circumstances that might be beneficial for the effectiveness of your policy intervention or not. And secondly, you even can consult available databases which gather evaluation studies and policy analysis that basically provide you scientific evidence on the effectiveness of specific policy interventions. So this basically is a good base for you to identify effectiveness. And from there, but then you can move to the final principle we identified in the next slide, which basically tries to test out whether your own choices and decisions you have made in identifying evidence can prove valid. And for this, we propose the principle of scientific expert deliberation. So we propose that after doing your desk research, you should organize expert consultations where basically the experts have to show that indeed the evidence they are proposing stands the test of your needs as a policy making entity. And for this purpose, we have identified a series of principles that allow you to assess whether deliberations bring the outputs you require. So overall, to sum up in just 2 sentences, we believe indeed that scientific evidence is still highly important for good and trustworthy policymaking. However, that the challenge of using evidence-based evidence resides primarily in important instruments and tools to identify and feed in good and sound scientific evidence into the policymaking process. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm curious to see what experts comment and add to my insights.
Thank you very much, Christian. Indeed, I'm also curious to hear from the experts, and thanks for outlining really all the challenges, but also the key principles, the evidence evaluation principles, and how they are all also interrelated among each others. So thank you very much. I will now ask. We will now move exactly to the comments from and the perspective of different actors in the field. And so, first of all, we have the perspective of the Parliamentary Research Service. European Parliament Research Service, and so that we are happy to have with us. So first of all, I would like to ask Christian van Lierop to give us his perspective on the manual from his own work. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in today's event. My name is Chris van Lierop. I work as an administrative manager in EPRS's Strategy and Innovation Unit. Now, as your discussions today will be focusing on the role that knowledge intermediaries play in detecting, processing, and presenting policy-relevant evidence for use by policymakers, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the European Parliamentary Research Services role in this context. Now, the EPRS, we are the European Parliament's think tank. We pride ourselves on providing members with independent, authoritative, and impartial research. As one of my friends said to me once, "Wow, Chris, you must work at the brains of the European Parliament." And I said, well, that might be going a little bit too far to say that we're the brains of the Parliament. But if we follow that analogy, if you will, for a little bit, we can say that indeed the people doing the real thinking of the brain when it comes to evidence-based policymaking is Directorate B. so within our internal structure. Its publications are drafted in-house or contracted out to external experts. That's the Directory for Impact Assessment and Foresight, and it's their publications and products that I'll be focusing largely on during the course of this brief presentation. So next slide, please. So any discussion on the role of a parliamentary research service such as EPRS in evidence-informed policymaking must necessarily begin with a brief look at the 4 stages of the legislative cycle. This is the circle of life, if you will, for people in the policymaking community, starting with the agenda setting stage, moving to the preparatory stage, the legislative stage, and then finally the post-legislative stage. So if we move to the next slide, please. I'd like to give you a brief overview of some of the key EPRS products across these 4 stages of the legislative cycle. So if we start with the agenda setting stage, EPRS helps to identify the need for new laws or for the revision of existing laws during this stage through its Cost of Non-Europe reports. These very popular reports scan EU policy areas to identify gaps in EU laws and to find opportunities where more EU action could be beneficial. Moving next to the preparatory stage, the EPRS supports the formulation of new legislative proposals. Its European added value assessments support legislative own initiative reports that are drawn up by the European Parliament under Article 225 of the TFEU, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Something that we are very pleased to now have. I'm sure you're all aware, but just to quickly recap, it gives the Parliament the right to put forward legislative initiatives, ideas for future legislative proposals. These European added value assessments examine potential benefits or European added value that could be achieved through the measures called for by Parliament in these reports. Moving to the legislative stage, we have our initial appraisals. EPRS supports deliberations by the co-legislators through initial appraisals which are routinely prepared. Now, initial appraisals they assess impact assessments prepared by the European Commission in connection with their legislative proposals. Initial appraisals check a set of quality criteria to see they've been met by the European Commission, and they also identify the strengths and weaknesses of the Commission's impact assessment for the given proposal, looking closely for compliance with the European Commission's better regulation guidelines. Also, in addition, the parliamentary committees can call on the EPRS to carry out its own impact assessments. This is particularly the case where Commission proposals lack an impact assessment, in which case the EPRS will prepare a substitute impact assessment, or in cases, for instance, where the impact assessment of the Commission is considered to be lacking in various respects, there the EPRS will prepare a complementary impact assessment. In addition, the EPRS the EP parliamentary committees can also ask the EPRS to prepare impact assessments of EP's substantial amendments to assess the changes that will be brought by the amendments put forward by Parliament. Lastly, we have the post-legislative stage. Here, the EPRS supports implementation, monitoring, and scrutiny of EU legislation. It does this firstly through implementation appraisals, which summarize the operation of existing EU legislation in a succinct manner just before the proposal of revised items of legislation by the Commission, and secondly through European implementation assessments, which provide support for parliamentary committees who are in the process of preparing own initiative reports on implementation. So I think we can move to the next slide, please. Now, those of you who've been listening will have noticed that I've referred to the fact that in some cases, parliamentary committees request specific EPRS products, and in other cases, they're just carried out. Well, in actual fact, the truth is a little bit more complex. Well, there are two types. We have studies that are produced automatically. Now, this is a case where I've used these perhaps a little bit awkward acronyms, but it's just to save space on these slides. When it comes to studies that we produce automatically, these are our initial appraisals, our implementation appraisals, European implementation assessments, and European added value assessments. Now, as I said, a number of studies are also requested specifically by the committees. This is the case for the cost of non-Europe reports, complementary impact assessments, substitute impact assessments, and the impact assessments on Parliament's substantial amendments. Now, why does that matter? Why is that of any interest to us all today? Well, we feel that the fact that EPRS produce reports, studies automatically, and the fact that the committees have to specifically ask for certain products, which you must understand is quite a complex process that requires broad political support within the given committee. These two factors taken together mean that ultimately they help to minimize the influence of individual MEPs and indeed political groups on requesting research. So if you remember, if I take you back to the beginning of my presentation, I talked about how we pride ourselves on ensuring independent, impartial, and authoritative research and analysis. We feel that these two aspects taken together, the requirement for committees to request certain publications and the automatic production of others, means that we can help minimize the political influence on our research and thus retain our independent and impartial aspects of our work. As a second point here on this slide, you'll see that many of our EPRS studies present findings and conclusions, but they often refrain from putting forward specific recommendations. Our studies outline possible courses of action, but we never say what actions should actually be taken. This decision is always left to the policymakers, and this ties in with something, some of the ideas that were put forward in your very interesting manual about the idea that this should be, the whole idea of evidence-informed policymaking being one of the factors that's taken into the evidence is one of the factors that's taken into account by policymakers, but ultimately is simply contributing to this whole process. The policy actions that are put forward in our studies usually present a range of possible alternatives, and they tend to reflect the wide spectrum of political views that exist within the House. So last but not least, but I think it's fairly self-evident, but just to reiterate the fact that our evaluation studies are ultimately a tool to help decision-making, and parliamentary committees are not bound to take the study findings into account. They're simply used to inform their political decision-making. So next slide, please. Here I'd like to very briefly touch on the data and evaluation methods that are used for EPRS studies. If we turn first to data, then our studies rely primarily on secondary data taken from the European Commission, Eurostat, other agencies. EPRS may carry out its own targeted surveys, but this is to complement data provided by the Commission and other sources, but this is rather limited by our own restricted resources in-house. The type of data that we seek in the reports that we draw our analysis on is we look for data that addresses the problem which is addressed by the given EU intervention, or indeed the lack of EU intervention, and data that can assess the actual or indeed potential impact of the given EU action. Essentially, this involves focusing on 4 types of impacts: the economic, the social, environmental, and fundamental rights impacts. Turning next to our evaluation methods, the evaluation methods in the European Parliament follow the approach taken by the European Commission in its better regulation guidelines. EPRS studies can draw on literature reviews, quantitative analysis, case studies, legal analysis, targeted surveys. The qualitative methods involving case studies and interviews generally seek to fill in gaps that cannot be addressed through the quantitative methods of analysis. When it comes to legal analysis, this tends to focus on compliance with subsidiarity and proportionality principles, and our ex post evaluation often reviews whether or not these principles were respected in the implementation of EU policy. Evaluation done by the EPRS tends to focus on the aggregate impact at EU level, and cost of non-Europe reports and European added value assessments in particular typically draw on advanced quantitative analysis where relevant data are available. Econometric analysis and non-parametric econometric analysis is also used, and as you all know, EU policy and indeed looking to the future can be a somewhat fickle affair, and so EPRS has a tendency and approach to use conservative assumptions in its quantitative modeling approaches. Next slide, please. I'd like to briefly now look at the impact of the EPRS products on the policymaking process. Of course, it's notoriously difficult to accurately quantify with any degree of certainty the impact that various publications can have on policymaking. But if we look first at the agenda setting stage, EP resolutions and indeed the Commission often refer to EPRS studies and will use them as arguments to support the need for further EU action. This is particularly true when it comes to our cost of non-Europe reports, a flagship publication of ours, arguably one of the most widely read EPRS products. Just to give you an example, this year's report found that a collective European response in 10 areas, including climate change, geopolitical conflict, and social inequalities, could offer benefits of up to 10 trillion euros a year, equivalent to 6,700 euros per citizen per year. So that's an example of a publication that's often helps feed into, as is written here, the calls of the European Parliament and the Commission for further EU action. If we turn next to the legislative stage, when it comes to our initial appraisals, we found they can make a constructive and practical contribution to the discussion of the legislative proposal in question at committee stage. Findings set out in our initial appraisals are often taken up or referred to in the explanatory statements of committee reports, and they often identify issues that MEPs may wish to investigate further and ask the Commission for more clarifications and explanations in certain areas. Our impact assessments of the EP substantial amendments help to strengthen the evidence base for amendments and to provide analysis to defend the adoption of amendments in committee or plenary. They can also lead to reconsideration about whether to maintain or support the Parliament's amendments, and lastly, they help focus discussion and could possibly lead to the adoption of compromises. Next slide, please. So if we look at the post-legislative stage, we've noticed it's common practice for committees to invite our experts, our policy analysts, to present the main findings of European implementation assessments at the committee meetings. Why is this important? Well, it gives committee members the opportunity to be able to interact directly with our experts and to really question them on certain areas and issues covered by our topics, our reports, particularly the EIAs, the European Implementation Assessments. This allows for a very invigorating and stimulating exchange of views and ideas, helping our experts to really answer the questions and contribute to the policymaking process. We found that during the last period from 2014 to 2019, almost 90% of the Parliament's implementation reports recognised our European implementation assessments as providing input. This was primarily in the explanatory statements, but in cases where our studies were considered to be the basis or indeed the main source of information, reference was made in the recitals of the given reports. So there we are. I think I should slowly wrap up my presentation. Indeed, it's taking a little bit longer than I thought it would. Just to say very briefly, if we look at the turn to the last slide, the next slide, I just want to give you a very brief example of how our reports, how our studies have fed into the policymaking process. This was the example of a horizontal substitute impact assessment for the EC's Migration and Asylum Pact. As you may remember, EPRS produced substitute impact assessments where there is no impact assessment from the Commission, and in this case we were able to really provide some very interesting evidence that was taken up in the draft report. The findings were taken up, referred to extensively by the rapporteur, and one final remark is this. I think it's a very nice quote, where the draft report stated that the substitute impact assessment concluded that Article 772B of the TFEU as the legal basis proposed for the screening does not allow for the proposed measures. Therefore, the rapporteur deletes Article 5 and all the corresponding references. So they have a very clear example of how the EPRS feeds into the evidence-based policymaking process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, also for providing this example, which was really very useful. Now I like also to remind participants online that they can put questions, are most welcome to put comments and questions in the chat. And also I would like to give the floor now to Nera Kuljanic, also from the European Parliament Research Service. Nera, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me just, I don't see my slides yet. Thank you. So I'm a colleague of Chris in the European Parliamentary Research Service, and administratively I'm placed in the same directorate that he just told you about, but more precisely, I work to support the STA Panel. So what is STA Panel? In the 1980s, the Parliament recognized that more and more issues that are coming before them as policymakers have a scientific and technological dimension, and they recognize the need to have an in-house office for scientific and technological options assessment. And this is how STOA came to life towards the end of the 80s. Today, the STA Panel is composed of 27 members of the European Parliament who are nominated by their committees, so they represent 11 different committees. And as such, they represent a link between the committees and the work that's being done there, I'm going back, and the mission of STOA. And they decide about STOA activities. STOA mission is carried out by providing committees and members with studies and information about introduce impacts of introducing and promoting technologies and identifying the best course of action to take in the policy. We also organize conferences, workshops, roundtable, all sorts of events where members can discuss directly with the researchers, experts, stakeholders, citizens about all sorts of topics that have technical, technological, scientific dimension and that are of political relevance. And we also host a European Science Media Hub that fosters dialogue between members, scientists, and the media about new technologies. STA studies, generally they can be of two types, either technology assessment or scientific foresight studies. Technology assessment studies look at relatively familiar technologies, their impacts, opportunities, challenges in the near future, and they try to describe and assess policy options in relation to these technologies. And scientific foresight studies, they look into the relatively new emerging technologies and their long-term impacts on the society. And in that way, with these studies, it's not about predicting the future, but trying to look at all different futures that we may end up living in and being prepared for the things that may happen, including the things that we don't want to happen or that we find undesirable. The methodology of our studies typically is literature reviews, secondary data, expert interviews, stakeholder interviews, or sometimes surveys. And as I already mentioned, these studies end with policy options, and all the studies are publicly available on our website. So, as I said already before, the studies are decided about the panel. So in that sense, it is a sort of a political decision because we are part of the European Parliament and these are members of the European Parliament. But it's not a decision of a single person, it's a decision of the panel. So in that way, they are detached from political preferences or influences of an individual member or a small group. In carrying out these studies, we have to follow, as administration, we follow public procurement rules. And this increases transparency vis-a-vis the public, but also vis-a-vis the contractors that submit tenders for doing these studies, because our studies are outsourced. What I find very important is when we seek this external expertise, that we communicate very clearly what are our needs and what are our demands for a particular product. And this includes the terms of reference. We will have a presentation that will go much more in depth on that after me. But I think it's important to say who we are as us seeking this expertise. What do we need? Do we need one report, 2, 3? Will there be a workshop? How are these things supposed to link with each other? Why do we need it? What is the background of our request? By when do we need it? And what is going to happen after? So once the study is done, will there be a discussion? What's the fate of this product, and how is that supposed to help the work of the Parliament? Then the policy options is a very important part of our studies. Here, the focus is again on options and not on recommendations. So it can be a range of possible action points. Some of them can be even mutually exclusive or not complementary. And these options have to be assessed against common criteria in order to represent a choice for the policymakers that then decide whether they want to take up something and what it is, which policy option they are going to take into account in their work. We also formulate quality criteria for our studies that serve as guidance for our contractors in the work that they do, and also for us to evaluate the study at the end and the work that was being done. And also in your manual and here in the discussion, the focus is on scientific evidence, but you recognize as well in the manual that there is other evidence as well. And this is something that, for example, in our scientific foresight studies is considered and a lot of attention is given to hopes and concerns of different stakeholders or citizens, different groups in relation to future technological and scientific developments in order to understand a wide range of options and this wide range of futures that we may end up in. And then a little bit about the impact. So the studies that we do are supposed to respond to the needs of members and committees of the European Parliament. And in that sense, they support the legislative, non-legislative work of the Parliament. They are often presented to committees during their meetings. So just to give a few examples of studies that we are doing or we did recently, we are now finalizing a study on digital product passport for the textile sector that will support the Parliament's work on the upcoming proposal on the revision of textile labeling that's supposed to come to the Parliament by the end of this year. So this is a bit in anticipation of that work that's going to come later. Last year, we did a study on a potential for a horizontal framework for climate labeling on products on the EU market. And this was timely for the Parliament's work on the Green Claims Directive. These are explicit environmental claims on products. We also carried a few years ago many studies on different aspects of artificial intelligence. This was intensive work that was ongoing for several years, and this was relevant for the work on the Artificial Intelligence Act. And many of these studies are simply just a tool to raise awareness on a certain topic, on certain issues, and to kind of open the door for members to investigate further. And then it's always hard to come up with numbers, but perhaps just to show a little bit that the work of STOA really is members find it interesting. Between 2014 and 2020, membership in the panel almost doubled. So we had in 2014, we had 15 members of the Parliament on the STOA panel from 9 committees. And since 2020, we have 27 of them from 11 different committees. And together with this increase, especially in recent years, we see really a big increase in proposals for STOA activities. So we are quite busy to implement all these ideas that members have for studies and for events. And just to conclude my presentation, I would like to say a few words about the European Science Media Hub that's also part of STOA. And it's like a baby of the STOA panel. It's 6 years old now. And the objective is to enable dialogue between members, the scientific community, and the media. And it promotes networking, training, information exchanges. And one of the main things that they organize is training and events for journalists. They also do media monitoring, so monitoring of news on scientific technological developments in the media. And they more and more engage in outreach and communicating about STOA products. So an example of a journalist event is their flagship event, a training for journalists, a summer school that took place last year on the topic of climate change and the challenges in communicating about climate change. And then the last slide is about all this communication and outreach. They are increasingly doing in-depth interviews and articles, either with experts that carry out our studies, where they can cover some additional angles of the research or go more into depth, or they interview experts that are not involved in STOA studies but are working on those topics that we are covering. Then they are producing multimedia products like videos and engaging on the social media communication. And the idea here is to create more impact, but also to give a platform to these researchers and experts and to let them speak about the work that they are doing to support evidence-informed policymaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nera. It was really interesting to discover more about the work of STOA and also maybe about this longer think-term approach that you have maybe in your research and the relation with media. I now would like to turn to Suan Lee, who is Senior Manager for EU Institution at Capgemini, who will bring us the perspective of a consultancy, one of those that receive the request, I guess, sometimes also from the EPRS or the Commission to deliver a study or an impact assessment. So please, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Carlota. Before I start, I wanted to check if the sound is okay. I'm having some technical issue. Okay, good. So yeah, very much appreciated for this opportunity and invitation to join the insightful debate. My name is Suhyun. I'm from Capgemini. Capgemini is known as a large IT firm, but we have a robust consultancy line. It's called Invent, so Invent Capgemini that I'm part of. We serve different government clients, and EU institutions are one of them. We also serve different commission services. And then our team has experience in receiving requests from the clients indeed. So today I would like to discuss the key elements. So maybe your colleague can start sharing the screen. Yes, thank you. So I have kept my presentation very brief. So the first page and then the last page will be that will be all. So I'd like to discuss today the key elements of the effective terms of reference for policy research, focusing on clarity. Now we can move to the next slide and the also last slide. Yes. So I'd like to focus on the three elements you see. Good TOR, terms of reference for effective policy research from a consultancy point of view. Starting with the first one, clarity and precision. So I have listed 3 points in there. From a consultancy point of view, it's extremely important to have a clear scope of the study. We also often see policy questions in the TOR, and it really helps us best understand on how to construct our research framework. And second one, also in the same pillar, it's really helpful to have smart objectives of the policy study, whether it's impact assessment or feasibility study or midterm evaluation of the policy, specific and measurable, so quantifiable, achievable, and relevant and time-bound. The last point in clarity and precision, better regulation guidelines is a great Bible. It's a great guideline. And sometimes we have noticed that some TOR does not really fully align with the BRG. Most of the time it is. So having a TOR really well aligned with the BRG is really helpful for the consultancies. So moving on to the second point, objective and evidence-based, evidence-informed. Now, after hearing all of you, now I should have changed from evidence-based to evidence-informed, following the EnTrust project. The first point on the evidence-informed approach is it should be evidence-based, evidence-informed indeed. And I think it's the key topic of today. So I'll move on to the second and then the third point. Call for robust methodology is very important for the consultancies, because we often, and then that's the third point, also it's mixed in there. And we believe the role of consultancies, contractors, is to really maintain the integrity of the research while also addressing the political ambitions, expectations. Sometimes it is reading between lines, or from a discussion with the client, there might have been previous discussions, the Parliament or the Commission, for preferred policy option when it's about impact assessment. Then our role is there to really collect the right data, scientific data, and then right framework to really investigate and research to see if the political expectation isn't aligned with the stakeholders' view and also literatures. So I think it's very important, because sometimes the political expectation can be expressed, and then it's for us to find the right balance. The last final point is a realistic timeline, and it's in line with the better regulation guideline. So we understand that sometimes there is an imminent deadline internally, and it's really utmost priority for us to really collect the right data and then given the right time frame. So with that as a last note, because yes, and then the second part is also important on the realistic timelines. from my experience, it's important to keep the frequent communication line, not only with our counterpart DG, but also with the ISSG. In the tour, it often mentions, okay, per deliverable, there is a related meeting. And then often as a PM, I suggest more informal checkpoint monthly, or as it needs. And I think it really allows both the client and the consultancy to be informed and then go towards the same goal, which is to make the evidence-informed policy research. So that would be it from my side. I kept it brief but to the point. Happy to receive any questions or not. But thank you very much, Carlotta, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it was very clear to the point. And actually, I mean, I have a question to all of you, because I think you all touched in your different presentation and comments the different evidence evaluation principle that Christian has outlined and that are part of the guide. And I actually wanted to ask you which ones, I mean, if you thought by reading the guide that some principles should be considered more or less. I also noticed that I think you didn't really touch the principle of evidence deliberation. So I'm also wondering a bit about that, if it's something that you use or not, and also if you think that in the guide there are things that are missing. Thank you. So I don't know, maybe we can start with Nira. Exactly, that's exactly what I wanted to do.
Thank you. So I read your manual. I find it very interesting, very useful. I was wondering, like, the reaction that I had to the first principle of appropriateness. I mean, often in the work that we do, we have the resource constraint. That's not always money, but it's often time, and this also affects the choice of your sources and of your methodology. So I was wondering, how do you see that fit, or maybe you don't see it fitting in this first principle that you have here? And also on the scientific expert deliberation. So in the scientific foresight studies, this is a very participatory that we do. It's a very participatory method, because in order to identify these hopes and concerns of different stakeholder groups or just different members of the society, the foresight approach is very multidisciplinary. The team that carries the project is multidisciplinary, but then there are also workshops where additional people are brought in to discuss different future scenarios in order to develop, to figure out the situation, the concerns, the hopes, and maybe policy pathways, how we can avoid certain futures and move more in the direction of some others. So that's like a form of reality check, no, of this. And then I was wondering if you have any thoughts of the role of artificial intelligence in bringing evidence to policy making, both the challenges, but also do you see some opportunities there? Because this is something that's like coming. It's not something we can avoid. So I was just wondering if you have some thoughts about that.
Thank you very much. As we don't have much time, maybe I'll ask also Suan Lee if you have any comment or questions, so we collect them all.
Actually, Nera already mentioned a point that I wanted to bring. So on the private sector, we discussed a lot the importance of AI. Also came from conference that I have also heard from the Commission side that there are movements in there. So in the manual can also something to be discussed and addressed.
Thank you very much. And Chris?
Thank you for giving me the floor. Very briefly, I very much appreciated this clear division into the 4 principles, which I think makes it very easy for people to follow. Just from our perspective at the EPRS, I think the principle of appropriateness is very interesting, particularly as we have to, the appropriateness of scientific evidence. So it's a problem we often have to contend with. How do we cover the whole of the European Union, all the member states? Do we have the resources to do that? Sometimes we're forced to focus specifically on a small selection of member states, and then the question is, what criteria do you use to make that decision? So that's I think that's something that merits further investigation.
Thank you very much. Christian, the word is yours to answer these comments and questions.
Yeah, well, I don't think that I need to answer them, because I think all of them are very valuable comments in themselves. I think that Nera and Chris and Suan has provided very, very illuminating insights. Just to mention one, indeed, the question of appropriateness refers to the question what evidence is available at all. And here I agree fully with Nera that questions of time and resource constraints are important to consider, also because they are topics and issues that are little researched. And I think policymakers are very often interested about new issues or future issues where you have very speculative evidence. So I think this is indeed a core issue, that for some policy debates, there is little evidence, and the efforts you have to do to assemble evidence is quite high. So I think there we have a strong dilemma that we have to solve with, and which was not basically the topic of our manual, because basically our manual is related to the question what when we look at the evidence we have, how do we make most productive use of this? It does not address the question is which evidence do we need if we don't have it? And I think this is a more intriguing and a more interesting question. I think your interventions, all of the 3, I think put a very strong emphasis on this challenge. And I think this is very illuminating. And the second issue, the artificial intelligence, this is a tough one. Because we still don't know how reliable basically artificial intelligence is in producing robust scientific evidence. But so far, what artificial intelligence is showing to be able to do is for explorative purposes. I think that artificial intelligence is very valuable. It can explore potential paths of research. It can explore potential evidence to be done, but then I would be convinced that more conventional forms of human-based evidence and research is necessary to follow up on these explorations and then do the sound methodology and a robust validity check. So, but I agree that we should be not only concerned about the risks of artificial intelligence, but potentially also about the opportunities it might provide in identifying future evidences.
Thank you, Christian. I also see in the chat a comment about ensuring a balance between quantitative and qualitative methods. So just to also flag this up very quickly. Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you very much then, as we are now reaching the end of our discussion and debate. So I would like to thank all the participants, all the speakers, and this was really very useful to get feedback and further perspective on the guide and on our work. And also thanks to all the people who participated and also for their comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Have a nice day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.
Bye-bye.